Hello there. So today I'm going to read a story called Delicate Creature. This was first published in a magazine called The First Line, which has a really interesting premise. They give you a first line to use, and every story published in each issue begins with that line and then goes wherever it goes. So here is my take on that first line. Mrs. Morrison was too busy to die. Her desk labored under stacks of paper. This one, ungraded essays from her freshmen. This one, unread manuscripts to be reviewed for the press. This one, course evaluations of all of the adjuncts, to be waded through to determine who would be rehired next semester. Her coffee cup, even, had gone so long untouched that when she would eventually attempt to peel it from the desk to fill it from the fresh pot, it would take a layered ring of the particle board surface with it, leaving a permanent scratchy circular tear. To top it off, her son's boyfriend Michael had finally proposed, and Greg was calling her nonstop with fresh litanies of questions. She was in the midst of speaking to Greg about a date for the nuptials when a sallow young man popped his head through her office door. Before he could say anything, she extended one finger, shushing him while Greg continued to weigh the pros and cons of a spring wedding date. The young man whose head was levitating in her doorway had skin like melted candle wax, and his hair was a limp yellow. Being framed by the bright white walls of Mrs. Morrison's office didn't do him any favors, only accentuating the sunkenness of his eyes, their closeness, the constant dilation of his pupils. She always expected snot to be running out of Burton's wide, flat nostrils, or saliva to dribble from the corners of his thin, pale lips. He was hardly the ideal poster child for the Reju-Flex program, but she supposed that was why he was a personal technician, introduced to clients only after they'd signed on, their $2,000 security deposits already squirreled away. He was also doggedly patient. While Mrs. Morrison grunted approval every few seconds at Greg's yammering, floral arrangements and catering choices and whether it would be a worthwhile risk going with an outdoor ceremony, some more titled perhaps, Burton simply hovered, his head and upper shoulders still the only parts visible in the doorway, as though the entrance to Mrs. Morrison's office was a force field, and that was the only portion of his body permitted to cross. He didn't so much as blink or cough or make a noise, shuffling his feet on the bristly carpet. Mrs. Morrison rolled her eyes toward the phone and made a circular motion with her free hand, indicating to Burton that she was trying to wrap things up. But it took several more minutes of "yes, Greg," and "mm-hmm," and "that's a lovely idea," before she could slow his rat-a-tat voice and intimate that she needed to go. "It's procedure day," she finally blurted, and Greg's voice came to a sudden stop, so quick she half wondered if the call had been dropped. But she'd known, of course, that this would shut her son up. He was the one who had insisted she enroll in Reju-Flex after she'd received her diagnosis. Stage 4, the tumors already marching deep within her body systems, boating from her ovaries into her lymph nodes, spreading like dandelion seeds blown from a stem. He'd suffered a momentary minor breakdown, crying into her lap. She should have been the one sobbing, not him. It was her body rebelling, poisoning itself, not his, but there she was, pushing a hand through her son's thick hair, shushing him while his tears stained her skirt. 27 years old and pouring salty streaks toward the very part of her body that had betrayed her. "Well, you should have just said so," Greg chirped. "I'll call you later tonight." She hung up, turning off her phone, and eyed Burton by way of apology. "It's no problem, Mrs. Morrison," Burton said, finally straightening and entering the room. He was a thin man, but wore baggy clothes meant for someone overweight, which only accentuated his scrawniness, the sleeves of his shirt swallowing mealy biceps and twiggy forearms that reminded her of chopsticks. His jeans, too long, covered his black loafers and scrunched over the carpet like a plump bag of leaves being dragged over grass. Burton knew not to take Mrs. Morrison's hand. She'd seen him do it with other clients, treating them as if the Reju-Flex regimen wasn't doing its job and they were frail and on death's doorstep and needed his physical support, as flimsy as lacking as it may be. But the first time he'd grabbed her fingers in his own, she'd yelped. His skin was cool and droopy like waterlogged sand, and she'd wrung her fingers like they'd been burned or squashed in a car door. Since then, Burton shuffled silently next to her, opening the passenger door in the company car, only after he assured her that this gesture was born not out of any belief that she needed help prying the door open, but simply company policy for technicians who drove their clients to the complex. And then letting the radio fill with silence between them as they drove the next 6 miles. Most clients relaxed in the back seat, attending to their phones or staring out the window, but Mrs. Morrison insisted on sharing the front with Burton. She didn't want to feel like she was being chauffeured or that he was one. This didn't mean they talked, chatting about the weather. The only other noise to be heard in the car or in the Rejueflex building besides the low chatter of the radio was the beep after Burton swiped his employee card across the access links when they arrived at the center. "We'd better hurry," Burton said as they shuffled down the long, narrow hall, the steely-colored gray that covered the walls, ceilings, and floors, creating a dizzying, nauseous feeling in Mrs. Morrison's gut. She suspected that this was on purpose, that Rejueflex wanted its clients disoriented and off balance, just queasy enough, which would make the once-every-6 months dying process more bearable by comparison. "Any delay could cause a relapse, you know." "Of course I know," Mrs. Morrison said, shaking her head. "That's why we schedule these 3 days in advance of their necessity, isn't it?" "You can't be too careful with this kind of thing," Burton said, stopping at the usual door. "Room 616, an odd number for a room on the first floor of a 3-story building." Mrs. Morrison always intended to ask Burton what the numbers meant, but by the time her sessions were finished, she was all jumbly-brained and forgot entirely about them until she saw them again 6 months later. The room was the same shimmering steel, the walls almost mirror-like, smeary reflections of Burton and Mrs. Morrison's bodies emanating off the ceiling and floor and creating the impression that a buzzing mass of people was watching the goings-on. The space was otherwise bare, with the exception of the Rejueflex pod in the center and the small table next to it. 8 feet long, the pod resembled an egg resting on its side, with the top third sliced off and its interior scooped out. Burton faced the door to offer Mrs. Morrison a semblance of privacy, although she had long suspected that all activity in the Rejueflex rooms was monitored by cameras she was convinced were hidden somewhere in the walls, or that one of said walls was actually some kind of advanced mirror, like in a police interrogation room, and that a line of surly medical professionals and researchers were gawking at her naked body. She peeled off her clothing one article at a time, starting with her shoes and socks and moving northward, ending with her bra, which she set atop the stack of fabric on the side table like the final flourish on an elaborate cake. Then she hoisted herself into the pod. It was only about 16 inches off the ground, so she could enter on her own as long as she steadied a hand against the cool metal, and laid down. Once nestled inside, feet in the stirrups and her head cradled in the neck brace, she pushed the only button on the interior, and the pod began to close with a pneumatic hiss. Inside was pitch dark aside from the minuscule glow of the red button, which cast her skin in a syrupy light, her fingernails like the stumps of claws. Dying this way wasn't so bad, she thought every time the pod began to whir. It felt like a million little pinpricks, like she was being covered in ants. They weren't ants, but nano-something or others. The process had all been spelled out for her in multisyllabic words with Latin and Greek prefixes and suffixes strung together in tongue-twisty chains. The nanos would crawl into her body and eat away at the cancerous tissue that would keep regrowing for the rest of Mrs. Morrison's life, in the process, spewing out fresh cells that would cling to her body and rebuild her. In the process, though, she would die. Only temporarily, her brain shutting down from the trillions of microscopic traumas happening inside her body, her heart and central nervous system unable to manage the pain and combustive destruction taking place all over. It was a bit like falling asleep, she always thought, but with a touch of numbness. When she was a little girl, she used to love the feeling. She would cross one calf over the opposite thigh and sit stone still, waiting for the feeling to drain away as the blood was cut off. Then, when her foot was motionless and blank, she'd poke at the arch to confirm. She would start to move it, will herself to wiggle her toes, give her ankle a spinning jerk. When she lifted the anesthetized foot from her thigh, the blood would rush back like a crowd jamming into a Walmart on Black Friday. Although a sharp, short pain accompanied the renewal of feeling, hundreds of needles jamming against her as the veins she imagined widened for the increased traffic, she always felt a wave of pleasure as she induced renewed feeling into her foot, its spasms as it refreshed its circulation almost orgasmic. Mrs. Morrison tried every time to withstand the bodily numbing as long as possible, a competition with herself to cling to consciousness longer each time. Burton had tutted at this, told her that things would run most smoothly if she simply listened to her body and gave in to the sleepy feeling. But this, she thought, ran counter to everything that made her a person. Was the desire to live not the greatest human impulse? We're told to fight, to cling. Heroes, blood-smeared and broken, are implored to stay with their uninjured sidekicks. Doctors scream at crashing patients to hang on. So why, even knowing she would be repaired and resurrected, would Mrs. Morrison not do the same? But the sleepiness, as always, overcame her. Burton's voice clamored through a tiny speaker near her right ear, as usual, just as her vision was starting to tunnel into little points, the scarlet hue of her pod dimming. He was counting down, starting at 10, and even then, in her final moments, as she felt lightheaded, her mouth dry, she willed herself to hear him finish his countdown, trying to imagine what might happen if he hit 0 and she was still awake. But as always, she heard a 7, the glimmer of a 6, and she was dead. The doctor who had diagnosed her cancer was young, his face unwrinkled, hairline thick and straight. He was clean-shaven, which made him look like a teenager. She almost laughed when he first walked in, his white coat a size too big because he was tall but narrow, slim-shouldered with an almost sunken chest. But when he spoke, his voice was loud and deep, a mismatch to the oval face and narrow nose and kind hazel eyes. He broke the news in what was, in Mrs. Morrison's estimation, the best way. A straightforward account of what the tests had revealed, a voice full of warm empathy without being pandering or pretending like he was personally affected by the results. He told her that the cancer was advanced to the point that an aggressive treatment plan would be necessary if there were any chance of prolonging her life. Full remission, though possible, was unlikely. He pressed a hand on her knee, a comforting, kind gesture that she didn't, until after her first Rejuvex treatment, think she was supposed to have viewed as inappropriate. His hand hadn't moved, hadn't dug into her skin to get a feel of what was beneath the long skirt that had blanketed her legs. It had simply sat there, a gesture of human connection, an anchor meant to keep her tethered through the maelstrom of the news he had to break. She never saw him again, of course, not after she decided to roll the dice with Rejuvex. But for reasons Mrs. Morrison couldn't explain, whenever she woke up from her treatments, his was the first face that flashed into her brain, hovering over her like he was greeting her after the procedure, his lips pulled into the unfettered smile that she had decided was his default facial expression. Then her other senses started to flutter, the whooshing feeling of blood in her ears, pulsing like she was listening to the inside of a conch shell from the whispered echo of the ocean. Her nose filled strangely with the aroma of birthday cake, coconut frosting that smelled like suntan oil. Tongue sensitive to the ridges of her hard and soft palate, everything cavernous and dry, her throat scratchy. And of course, last but most potent, the feeling running up and down her body of tight youthfulness, the tingling feeling fading and replaced by the warmth of sitting on a rubber-backed lounge chair by a pool, skin soaking up the rays of the sun. The pod opened, and instead of the kindly doctor, Mrs. Morrison was greeted by Burton, half smiling, his stringy lips open, revealing two small, overly crowded teeth that were in desperate need of the corralling powers of braces or a retainer. He offered her a hand, which she took, even she knew her own limitations. And having just been revived, she was, although lithe and already starting to feel 20 years younger, wibbly-wobbly in her legs and shoulders. Burton's eyes were averted again, her nudity more embarrassing to him than to her, and she found herself, as usual, wondering if Burton had ever felt another person's intimate touch, whether he'd managed to wrangle his way into losing his virginity. She tried to picture Burton removing his clothes in front of another person and was met with a wall of blank nothing, no more sensate than the Rejuvex walls. She dressed, and Burton led her down the hall and into the cool mid-afternoon. When they arrived at her building, he got out of the car with her, but didn't follow her inside. Burton handed her a familiar packet of pills. To be consumed daily within 30 minutes of waking up, he said, knowing that she already knew the directive. I'll see you in 6 months. Burton even offered up a formal bow, a flourish that Mrs. Morrison smirked at every time, despite her attempts to the contrary. Her office was just as cramped and stuffed with work as when she left. Each time she hoped that somehow, by some miracle, the work would be gone. Papers graded, manuscripts vetted, evaluations summarized, and employment decisions made. When she'd first signed up for Rejuvex, the appointment counselor she'd spoken with had told her to really think about what time of day and what day of the week Mrs. Morrison would want for her appointments, because to keep the Rejuvex treatments as regulated as possible, she would have to schedule all of them for the rest of her near-eternal life at the same time. During that phone call, she had been mired in work, her desk just as towering with papers, appointment books stuffed with meetings and observations and seminars. So she'd flip to the next day on which she had a 3-hour free block, a Wednesday, that peaking camel's hump in the weekly calendar, and, imagining the freedom of escaping the mountains of work around her for nearly 200 minutes, she felt a giddying excitement when she pronounced Wednesdays at 11:30 her ideal treatment time. But she'd quickly discovered the error in her thinking. Back in her office at 3 p.m., she felt no desire to attempt to chisel away at the block of work sitting before her. Mrs. Morrison never wanted to slide into her desk chair after being resurrected, her body washed clean of the encroaching cancerous cells, her every muscle and flap of skin tight and buoyant. She wanted to run marathons, eat an entire bucket of fried chicken, parasail over the Mediterranean. Anything to celebrate the renewal of her body. Anything except correcting the citation mistakes in her students' essays. She sat on one of the visitors' chairs on the far side of her desk and called Greg instead. He picked up his litany right where he'd left off, spurring out questions about the caterers, whether they should rent a photo booth, is the idea of Friday evening ceremony and reception 1-2 combo completely insane, without giving Mrs. Morrison an inch to answer before doing so himself. She didn't mind. Greg's voice was lilting and well-sped, never overly hyper in its gusto, but eternally tinged with excitement. He rarely called to levy complaints. Despite the success of her Rejueflex treatments, she knew that Greg thought of her as a delicate creature, like a Fabergé egg, something meant to be hidden under a glass case atop a poofing satin pillow, and she knew he thought that any indication that his life was anything but perfect would do her irreparable harm. So he kept his voice warm, always finding the positive in whatever story he had to tell her. Right now, guests would be able to save money on on hotel rooms, plus venues are so much cheaper on Friday than Saturday. Wanting her to just listen and offer up a grunted affirming reply once in a while, so he knew she was still there. She couldn't blame Greg. His father had been a stoic statue, coming home from work as a bricklayer after dusk every day for the first 12 years of his son's life, pulling his still-warm plate of food from the oven where Mrs. Morrison kept it for him after she and Greg ate by themselves at the sprawling dining room table she'd purchased with fanciful dreams of dinner parties. Years later, able to look back and laugh at herself, wondering what she, the mediocre cook who more often than not screwed up mashed potatoes, had been thinking. He would then pry open a bottle of beer and settle himself in his recliner and watch the news all night, cycling between channels and listening to different versions of the same top story over and over. When he was a child, too young to understand the vibrations that other human beings gave off, Greg would sit at his father's feet and talk about his day, a babbling monologue that his father would engage with thorough periodic grunts. As Greg aged and his endless churn became a more shapely narrative, his father's responses grew more distant until they were non-existent, his father no more animated than the furniture on which he sat. And then his father left. No fanfare, no explosive argument between Mrs. Morrison and her husband, no complaints about his tight-lipped iciness or her tunnel vision about her job. Student essays sprung up around the house in the oddest of places: the coffee table, nightstand, kitchen counter, fireplace hearth. One day, he simply didn't come home after work. Mrs. Morrison took the extra plate before she went to bed and tossed it, porcelain and all, into the garbage, nonplussed by her husband's absence. Greg kept up his day's dirge, directed at his father's empty chair, but the next morning he became tight-lipped, somehow immediately aware of the change that had come over their home, the permanent blanket of new emptiness that only one day later had reshaped their lives. "Greg," Mrs. Morrison said, interrupting his meandering thoughts about who he would choose as his best man, "do you want to have dinner tonight?" After a short pause, the phone filled with the static sound of a long, loud exhalation of breath from Greg. "Michael and I have plans. We're going out to celebrate the engagement." Mrs. Morrison bit her lip, imagining her son doing the same. If anything had been reliable and certain in their lives, it had been that when Mrs. Morrison offered to treat her son to a meal, he said yes. Even if he had plans, and by the law of averages she knew he must have sometimes had them when she made her inquiries, he would cancel them to drive the 30 minutes to meet her, transfer to her car, and shuffle off to whatever quiet, lamplit restaurant she had chosen. She always paid, despite the fact that they both knew that as a senior partner, at such a young age, less than 30, at a major downtown accounting firm that audited colleges all over the country, including Mrs. Morrison's, he made more money than she did. With a meager goodbye and a dribbled out, "I understand," Mrs. Morrison hung up the phone and let it drop into her lap. She looked at her arms, running each hand over the opposite bicep and forearm, letting her fingers tickle her taut, milky skin. Sometime in her life she'd heard a statistic on how many billions of skin cells flake off in a given day, how they're replenished anew, to the point that we cycle through several versions of ourselves. The cells that make up our bodies on our first birthday are all dead and gone when we are in our 60s. Perhaps, she thought, the cycle was even shorter, that we replaced ourselves many times over. So who, she wondered, was this person sitting in her chair, staring at her arm, a phone's shiny reflective surface echoing her face up at her, nostrils amplified, capturing the slight flare with each breath she took? Whose arm was this? Did it belong to her, or the machine at Rejueflex that rooted around in her body and excised the uncooperative cells like a dentist clearing out a cavity? Mrs. Morrison made a fist, tight, and stared at the twisty twitch of muscle in her arm. Ignoring the stacks of paper on her desk, and tamping down the desire to shove them off in an avalanche of half-baked sentences and comma splices, she pulled open the top drawer and rooted around. Somewhere in there was Burton's business card, the one he'd given to her on the first day. She was to call him if she needed anything or felt any unusual side effects: dizziness, intense nausea, spotty vision. Also, if everything suddenly went grayscale like she'd stepped into an episode of Leave It to Beaver, she must call immediately. There it was, folded over and faded, beneath a heap of paper clips. She scanned the number and began to put it into her phone, but before she could bring herself to make the call, Mrs. Morrison paused, phone hovering near her face. Was an existential crisis, brought on by her son's innocuous rejection, a side effect worthy of reportage? Of course not, she thought, clenching the card into a crumpled, jagged ball. She threw it back into the drawer, upsetting the mound of paper clips. Mrs. Morrison inhaled deeply, her rejuvenated lungs expanding and stretching against her effervescent muscles. She was a busy woman, and there was, in her mind, no chance of that changing anytime soon. The end.